Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 20 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to talk AFC North. So we have a divisional preview, we're going to talk some player predictions, I have a buy, sell, sleeper, and breakout candidate for the division as a whole. So we're going to get into all of that, and this will be the first episode in a series where throughout the summer, we'll do the same thing for each of the other divisions. I'll give a preview, talk about all the players, and then give some buys and sells, breakouts, and sleepers. But before we jump into that, a couple things. If you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, YouTube, any platform that carries podcasts. We're out there. We're on it. Give us a follow. Share with your friends. We appreciate your support. And if you're on Twitter, social media, you can find us there at Dynasty War Room. And we have a Facebook page as well. You can find us there if you're not on Twitter, now called X. But, I will always refer to it as Twitter. So go find us there. Go subscribe to us on YouTube. We appreciate it. And the Listener League. So last week, our big announcement was that we were starting a Listener League for this podcast. We had a great group of interest, and so we have a full league. We have everything set up, ready to go. So I appreciate everyone that was interested, that reached out, and it should be a really fun league. So we'll have updates on that throughout the podcast, throughout the season as well. So thank you all again for the support on that. Should be great. And without further ado, let's just jump right into today's episode. So AFC North, right? It's a pretty competitive division. Should be one where, I think every team thinks that they have a pretty solid chance at both making the playoffs and winning the division. And so we're going to start, we'll go in alphabetical order, but they also happen to be the defending division champions, the Baltimore Ravens. First team we're going to talk about, at quarterback, of course, Lamar Jackson. He's currently valued as the QB4 on Keep Trade Cut, which I think is fair. It's fine. I personally have him at QB5. I do have Jalen Hurts ahead of him, as well as the usual suspects in Mahomes and Josh Allen. But I also have CJ Stroud ahead of Lamar Jackson for dynasty purposes. Redraft, that is certainly not the case. Or if you're, a contender on like a 2-year window or something like that, I would prefer Lamar Jackson in that scenario. I think CJ Stroud just is over Jackson from a consensus standpoint at this point, largely due to age, which, makes sense. We've seen that happen over the years with guys like Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow, where they have, really strong rookie or sophomore seasons. They skyrocket up in the rankings because everyone goes after those young star quarterbacks. So obviously they bring some different things to the table, but Lamar Jackson, whether you have him at 3, 4, or 5, I think that's all fair. A good target in the early to mid portion of your startup drafts, and somebody that you're probably not going to be able to acquire in a trade. It's probably just a situation where if you have Lamar Jackson, you're just going to hold him on your roster. But nevertheless, somebody that should have another good fantasy season with the Ravens. So at running back, it's a bit of a new backfield. So Derrick Henry takes over, comes over from Tennessee. He's valued right now as the running back 17 on Keep Trade Cut, which is something where I was pretty down on Derrick Henry, and I think a lot in the fantasy community were, but he's risen a bit throughout the offseason because I think we've realized, number one, that he is in a very, very good situation in Baltimore. There's no competition. There's nobody that's going to be coming over, no committee, anything like that. So that's certainly a big factor. He's just a bell cow running back. And he's kind of one of those very unique players where typically at this stage in their career, we would be really fading somebody like Derrick Henry. But I do think that he's unique enough that he still has one very good fantasy season left. So I'm not out on Derrick Henry altogether like I maybe would have been, 5 or 6 months ago. But he's somebody that I think is a very high 1-year ceiling. So if you're a contender, a true contender, this would be somebody that I'd be looking to target because I don't think it's going to take a first-round pick to acquire him. It may, but, again, if you're a true contender, you're probably talking about the 10, 11, 12 in your draft. But even then, I think you can get Derrick Henry for a second-round pick plus, a smaller piece to go with it. I just don't think the cost is going to be that high, especially if it is a rebuilding team that has him. So if you're a rebuilding team, I would, push for that first round pick in return. But again, I think a trade can be made there, given the short window of production that he presents. But in terms of the rest of the running backs in this backfield, I'm not really interested in many others. But, again, this is Dynasty, and Justice Hill, Rashina Lee, both I think are, have some sleeper depth potential, somebody that you can throw onto your bench. I think both are essentially free right now. It would cost less than a fourth-round pick for either one of these guys. So if you're a Henry manager or somebody that's thin at running back, but you don't have the ammo to go out and get, a running back 1, running back 2, you can take some shots on these types of flyers, because should injury occur, Justice Hill is probably going to take over and have a pretty heavy workload. Lee, same sort of deal. He'll certainly be involved. I'm pretty much out on Keaton Mitchell. He had some flashes last year, but given the injury situation with him, I'm not sure when he'll even come back this year. So between the depth chart and the added competition and the injury, I'm not adding Mitchell really in any circumstances. But Henry, somebody, if I'm a contender, I'm very much interested in. Moving over to wide receiver, Zay Flowers is somebody that I think has huge breakout potential. I think we already kind of saw, the small breakout at the end of last season when Mark Andrews was out. He really produced, and this is somebody that could find themselves, instead of a low-end wide receiver 2 in Dynasty value, could be a high-end wide receiver 2 for Dynasty, somebody in that 12 to 15 type of range. So very excited about his potential. He's the clear wide receiver 1 on this team, and he doesn't really have any other sort of competition. I think Rashad Bateman, who probably is the second starter on the outside right now, if you want to throw a fourth-round pick at him, maybe a late third, something like that, I think that's perfectly fine. He certainly has a chance to break out, but we've been talking about that for a little while now, and we still haven't seen anything between the injuries and just the lack of production in general. But, we're talking about Nelson Aguilar and then Devontae Walker as really the other receivers worth mentioning. So Walker is somebody that if you're not a Bateman believer, given the fact that he hasn't produced, Devontae Walker was a late fourth-round rookie pick. So somebody else that is easily acquirable if you're just looking for some young, breakout potential type of pieces that could turn into something. I don't think Devontae Walker is going to end up ever being a wide receiver 1, but could he turn into somebody that gives you some bye week, flex potential at some point in his career? Certainly. So, no issues if you want to take a flyer on him. I'm pretty much out on Nelson Aguilar and the rest of the receiver room. But my only concern here with Zay Flowers is, can he produce at a wide receiver 1 or 2 level while Mark Andrews is healthy? So his breakout last year came largely with Mark Andrews on the bench due to injury. So something that will be interesting to see this year is kind of how those two mesh now that, Flowers will be in year 2, Andrews back from injury. How will those things kind of go together? I think they'll be fine. I am perfectly happy adding both. In fact, Flowers and Andrews are 2 players in this division that are certainly on my buy list. So I'm not worried, but I think that's your argument if you're, if the Flowers manager is looking to sell, and, there's some conversation there to be had that you might be able to negotiate a little bit of a lower price given those concerns. But I'm not worried. I don't think you should be worried about Mark Andrews either, who is currently the tight end 6 on Keep Trade Cut, which I think is vastly undervaluing Mark Andrews, to put it frankly. I mean, he's a really, really, really good tight end. I mean, we're talking to one of the few guys that has true tight end 1 overall potential. There's maybe 6 or 7 guys total that could even possibly do that. But if you're talking realistic candidates to do that, I think there's probably about 5 or so. I think we're talking Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride. Those are, to me, the clear top 4 in terms of this season alone. But then you're probably looking at Dalton Kincaid and maybe Kyle Pitts. But again, I think that's a pretty big, I think that'll be a stretch for Kyle Pitts to jump from where he's been up to number 1. But Mark Andrews has been there. He's been a top 2 tight end for years. and it's hard to project health, right? But if he does stay healthy, he will certainly finish better than tight end 6 on the season. So he's a buy right now for me. I'm a huge fan of what he can do on the field. And then there's Isaiah Likely, who's tight end 19. The Ravens and the Vegas Raiders are the only two teams with 2 tight ends in the top 20 right now on Keep Trade Cut. And it's a difficult situation because Likely has been good when on the field as a starter. He's young. He certainly has some upside. However, he hasn't really done much in terms of producing from a fantasy standpoint when Mark Andrews has been healthy. So as much as the Ravens like to say we're going to get both involved and all of that, it's sort of a one or the other type of situation. So the way I view it is if I'm a Mark Andrews manager, I would be making Isaiah Likely a priority target this offseason. I don't think the cost is overly expensive for him. People recognize the upside, but I think there's also a very clear, understanding that this is a backup tight end. So something to keep in mind of if you were the Likely manager, especially if you're a contender, it's something where you have a couple choices. You can either hold out for an Andrews injury and then, keep him for yourself or trade him at a significant premium. Or if you want to get that value now in the offseason, you can go to the Andrews manager, see what kind of deal you can work out. I'm sure that there will be some interest. Moving on over to the Cincinnati Bengals, who struggled a bit last season, but now with their quarterback, Joe Burrow, back from injury, they certainly should be back in the playoff mix, the AFC, title contending group of teams. And Joe Burrow right now is quarterback 6 on Keep Trade Cut, which I think is perfectly fine. It doesn't excite me. He's not really somebody that I'm targeting or somebody that I'm excited about in the middle of a startup, first round or acquiring in general. I think it's fine, right? I think QB6 is the right spot, but I think there's a very clear tier break between Burrow and Lamar Jackson, at least in terms of fantasy football, right? If we're talking, real life NFL, Joe Burrow, sure, there brings something different to the table. But for fantasy football, where that rushing upside is so important, that's where I think there's a very clear separation between guys like Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow. And I think it is close enough that with Anthony Richardson in this QB6 versus QB7 type of discussion that I don't think it's a clear ranking between those two as well. So just something to keep in mind. He's perfectly fine. He's not going to be, somebody that I think is overrated, underrated. He's a great quarterback, perfectly fine where he is. If you have him on a roster, you are probably just holding on to him. And that's really all there is to be said about Joe Burrow. Moving over to the running back position, though, it's a little bit more interesting because there's Zach Moss at running back 34 and Chase Brown at running back 37. So this sort of ambiguous backfield is something that can be very interesting for fantasy because chances are one of these players will, fairly significantly outperform their current, rank and value. Which one, it's hard to say. I do think that Zach Moss probably is going to get to start as the leader of that committee, which is, of course, why he is priced ahead of Chase Brown. I do think that Chase Brown probably has a higher ceiling, a bit more explosive, but Zach Moss probably is a little bit more that goal line running back. So both, I think, present some value, not necessarily as RB2s, but running backs that you can flex, that you can have as depth on your bench, plug in on bye weeks, but certainly as flex options, in those deeper dynasty leagues, starting 10, starting 11. So perfectly happy with both. I personally would probably rather go after Chase Brown at cost, but both of these guys are pretty affordable, and I'm happy to have either one on my roster. Moving over to wide receiver, we have Jamar Chase, who's kind of the known superstar, currently valued as the wide receiver 3 behind Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb. And there's T. Higgins at wide receiver 25, and then Jermaine Burton at wide receiver 59. I'm not sure that there's anybody else in this wide receiver group that is worth mentioning that's going to have a significant dynasty impact. I think Jermaine Burton is probably the cutoff there. However, things could certainly change should T. Higgins be traded before the season. He did sign his tender, so he'll almost assuredly play without being traded this season in Cincinnati. And so he should have some good production, right? But T. Higgins, he's somebody that I've talked about a lot on this show throughout the past couple months, including last week's episode. But even since then, he's been falling in value on Keep Trade Cut. He's down 2 spots just from last week at the wide receiver position. So while I don't prefer him for all the reasons I mentioned last week, I do think that he's starting to reach a cost that is a little bit more palatable, something that I'm a little bit more comfortable with, because I think he's a very steady wide receiver 2 when healthy, and he does have contingent upside as well, because if Jamar Chase gets hurt, T. Higgins does assume that number 1 role, but Higgins himself has had some issues staying on the field and will probably end up on a new team in 2025. So a little bit more risky, certainly some question marks there, but he is starting to fall into a territory where I'm not actively selling him as much as I have been in the prior few weeks, to months. And then Jamar Chase, there's not a lot to say about him, right? He's a clear, top 5 dynasty wide receiver. Whether he's your number 1 or number 5 or somewhere in the middle, I think there's certainly a debate to be had. He's personally my wide receiver 4, because I also have Amon-Ra St. Brown ahead of him in the number 3 spot. So, but still, number 4 overall receiver in Dynasty. He's young. He's awesome. He should have a great season. And it's somebody that is pretty attainable in the Burrow-Chase stack in Dynasty. So, if you are a Chase manager, you go make some offers for Joe Burrow and vice versa. It's going to be a great stack to have throughout the season. At tight end, there's really only one player worth mentioning. That's Mike Gesicki, tight end 34, who is pretty much being left for dead. But he does have some upside in this offense. He's more of a pass-catching running back, or tight end, and he's been in some tough fantasy situations, both in New England and then in Miami, where the Miami offense is not really suited for a tight end as a pass catcher. So there is some bounce back potential here. And somebody that you can throw on the end of your bench for almost nothing. You can probably acquire him for less than a fourth round pick at the worst. I have a hard time believing that somebody's going to be charging you more than that for him. But if you're a contender and you want to have a little bit more, bench depth, get some added flexibility, Mike Gesicki certainly somebody that you can target. Moving on to the Cleveland Browns. So Cleveland has been a team that I didn't fully realize it until after the fact, after, looking back over the show sheets for the, buys episode and the decreasing value post-draft and bust episode, things like that. We've had a few different episodes where we're focusing on kind of the more negative aspect of, the offseason in fantasy. And I've had a lot of Browns players on those episodes. Frankly, I've had one at every position on at least one of those 3 shows. So it kind of tells you how I feel about, the Cleveland Browns in 2024, probably below average on them. I think they're probably the team that's going to finish in 4th in this division, which, considering they made the playoffs, would probably be a bit of a collapse for them. Great defense, but again, in fantasy, we're only focused on the offense. And at quarterback, Deshaun Watson, QB 25, he's not someone that I'm really interested in really at all. He's being valued low enough within the quarterback market that he's not a complete just, throwaway trade at all cost type of guy, because that value is not, in the late teens or anything like that, where I think it was, just a few months ago. So, I'm not excited about Deshaun Watson. I just don't think he has the upside that he used to have. I don't think he's going to be able to run around as much. And I don't see a top 5 season in the cards for him at all for the rest of his career. It was a terrible contract for Cleveland. Everybody knows it. So that's what gives him a little bit more value, because he's stuck there for at least a few more years. So, if you're looking for a QB2 that you just need to know that, assuming health is there, that he'll do something for you, that's fine. I would much prefer him as a QB3 on my roster. But, given the way the quarterback market is, that might be a little bit tough to pull off. But I don't think the ceiling is there, which for somebody that used to have rushing upside, he doesn't have that high end, ceiling that there just once was. And so between that and the fact that he hasn't really played a full season in what feels like a million years, doesn't have the greatest weapons, and he plays in a very tough division full of great defenses. So I'm out on Watson. I'm pretty much out on the entire Cleveland offense. But the one player that I'm probably more in on than anybody else is running back Jerome Ford, who's currently valued as the RB40, which is behind Nick Chubb, who's RB38. And then there's also Donta Foreman in this backfield going at RB80. So my biggest takeaway from this is that I just cannot believe that Nick Chubb is being valued above Jerome Ford. And not that I think Jerome Ford is some awesome running back, because I think he's relatively average, kind of inefficient, but he had some nice games last year. But Nick Chubb is coming off a brutal injury. He's getting up there in age. We don't actually know when Nick Chubb is going to return to the field. It's very likely that he misses a significant portion of the regular season. And it seems like people just are glossing over that fact, or that even if he does end up, getting ready in September, it's going to be tough sledding. It's coming back from these injuries. It usually takes at least a full year before returning to any sort of form. So I'm completely out on Nick Chubb. I would be trying to trade him pretty much at all costs if I were to have him on any of my rosters. I don't think I do. So I don't see any upside there. I think that it's a very, very low floor with him, even though we know that he's a very talented player. He's had an awesome career, but I just don't know that he's able to come back from this type of injury at this stage, late in his 20s. So that's where I'd rather have Jerome Ford, especially at cost. So you can get him for pretty cheap. I think he'll be the starter most of the year. Again, whether he's going to give you huge numbers, that's certainly up for debate. But if you're looking for a volume play, I do think that Jerome Ford is a candidate there. At wide receiver, we have Amari Cooper, wide receiver 42, Jerry Jeudy coming in at wide receiver 60, Elijah Moore, David Bell, Cedric Tillman, a lot of names, right? So Amari Cooper ended the season with a bang in that huge game with Joe Flacco. Jerry Jeudy, a disappointing season in Denver, and then gets traded over to Cleveland and signs an extension, which, the trade to Cleveland, not necessarily awesome for his fantasy value, but the contract is always nice to see. Elijah Moore, David Bell, Cedric Tillman, all, maybe had their moments, but, I in particular was a huge David Bell fan coming out as a rookie, but, I think that ship has sailed for all three of those guys. So Cooper is really the only one that I think possesses, starting value in fantasy right now. He should give you an okay season, have some decent games, but his price has also dropped. Really, all these receivers, the price on these guys, their market value has fallen considerably over the last several months, which I think is fair. I think it's the right move. It does make them a little bit easier to acquire or to, feel okay about adding to your roster, but I'm really not seeking any of these players. And just because I think the offense as a whole is going to really struggle. Deshaun Watson, below average quarterback play, potential below average running game with an injured Chubb and, Jerome Ford leading the way. Amari Cooper certainly has the talent, but he's getting up there in age. And then Jerry Jeudy, we just have never seen consistent play. We had, some flashes with the Broncos, but I have a hard time believing that Cleveland is where suddenly he's going to break out and be this, star fantasy receiver that we were all hoping for. So pretty much out on all of the above. And unfortunately, moving over to tight end, I'm also not all that in on David Njoku. He was on, my bust list, and it really has less to do about Njoku as a talent as it does his situation. We talked about him in depth last week, so if you want, the full deep dive, go check out the prior episode 19 on Spotify, Apple, whatever your preferred platform is. But he had his best season and his best weekly numbers last year with Joe Flacco at quarterback. His points per game average dropped significantly compared, with Watson compared to Flacco. So I am worried about what his production will be like moving forward, especially considering he was kind of a one-year wonder, first-round pick, but he just hadn't really been that fantasy relevant over the years. So he's young enough that hopefully that breakout was enough to keep him in the top 12 over the next few years, but I'm not all that optimistic about it. I think it's going to be a very inconsistent season. Certainly somebody that will provide you with some value and is probably going to be starting for you if you have him on a dynasty team. But I would be very uncomfortable if you were my only, solid starting tight end. I would be looking to acquire some depth at the position if I was a David Njoku manager. Last but not least, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Steelers are a very, very interesting team for fantasy this year because there's so many question marks. And it starts at quarterback because Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, Wilson is QB 33, Fields is QB 28 on Keep Trade Cut. And it's interesting because Justin Fields is by far the quarterback with the higher fantasy upside. He has the rushing ability. He's done it before the last 2 seasons when he has been healthy and on the field. He's produced some crazy fantasy numbers. He helped one of my teams to a championship. So we've seen it a bit with Justin Fields. However, traded from Chicago to Pittsburgh, where he's almost assuredly going to be a backup, at least at the beginning of the season, behind Russell Wilson, who was okay in Denver, but certainly nothing special, hence the, why he is now in Pittsburgh. So if you're a contending team, I personally would rather have Wilson because I do think he's going to start. I do think that he's probably going to last the majority of the year as the starter. I think he's in a better system with, a better coaching staff, which could be a little bit weird to say because Sean Payton certainly, has his accolades. But Mike Tomlin, I think, will be able to put Russell Wilson in a better position to succeed. It's going to be a run-heavy offense. Arthur Smith is there. So a little bit worrisome from the passing, standpoint in this offense, but should be a solid situation for Russell Wilson to walk into. Now, it wouldn't surprise me, though, should this team struggle, that later in the season, Justin Fields take over. So that's why, from a best ball standpoint, it's a very difficult team to try to draft one of these QBs because you don't actually know who's going to be the quarterback come, the playoff time of the regular season. So, something to be cautious of that, you're probably not going to necessarily get an entire season out of either one of these guys. But if you're a rebuilding team, Fields is somebody that is somebody that I would go target because I don't think the cost is going to be that crazy. But should he take over as a starter at some point in the year or as a free agent leaves and gets a starting job, that will provide some significant fantasy value moving forward because of his legs. 2 running backs that I am very interested in this season, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. So Harris is running back 27, Warren is running back 23. I personally would probably have those flipped. I think I am more interested in Najee Harris still, even though the fact that it kind of seems like he's losing his explosiveness a little bit. Jaylen Warren, probably the more electric running back. But I think both of these guys are going to play a ton. It's going to be a committee, but I think that both should be very good. Both can catch the ball. Russell Wilson is going to dump the ball off a lot, just like he did last year in Denver. And as we mentioned, Arthur Smith is there as the OC, and he's going to run the ball. So both of these guys should be very effective fantasy options. While I don't think either one will be, RB1s, I do think that there's a possibility that both could be mid to low-end RB2s, which would be very nice for fantasy to be able to, have 2 good fantasy running backs on the same team. I think their production both should be a little bit better than last year, and they were already fairly solid as it was. So, Najee Harris has dropped off significantly from where he was a few seasons ago, deservedly so, but I think he's reached a point now where I'm much more comfortable acquiring him. He's still young enough. I fully expect him to get a second contract. It probably won't be with Pittsburgh, so that's something to be aware of, that he's probably going to be on a new team. But again, that's something you can use in a trade negotiation to your advantage. And, a relatively cheap with running back with RB2 upside is somebody that I would absolutely want to have on my fantasy team. Wide receiver, George Pickens is really the only, true difference maker at the position for Pittsburgh. He's currently valued as wide receiver 26, but there is Roman Wilson at wide receiver 55, the rookie out of Michigan, and Van Jefferson on this team as well, with a few other guys, Calvin Austin, etc. But George Pickens to me is somebody that I think has real breakout potential, especially because I think he's going to get better quarterback play, regardless of whether it is Wilson or Fields. I think either one will be better than the collection of quarterbacks that Pittsburgh had last year. So even though they're going to be more run heavy, even though Arthur Smith, didn't do Drake London any favors, Pickens has been producing with bad quarterback play the last couple seasons. So I do think that he can continue to do so. And I really think the breakout could be there. So Pickens is somebody that I am happy acquiring. I'm not going to overpay necessarily for him, but I think at fair market price, he certainly has the ability to jump up into that wide receiver 2 range overall in fantasy this season. So, and he's shown that he has that big game ability to, that huge, 100 yards and 2 touchdowns types of performance. He's done it before, and he's somebody that I like in this offense. One more note, too, on the receivers. I do actually like Roman Wilson over Jermaine Burton. So we mentioned Wilson and Burton, kind of 2 guys going in the early third of rookie drafts. Both have a lot of potential, but because Wilson is really the clear wide receiver 2, in my opinion, over Van Jefferson in this offense, whereas Burton is going to certainly have to wait another season behind T. Higgins as well in that offense, I would prefer that earlier breakout potential with Roman Wilson over Jermaine Burton, who I think will be somebody that you can try to acquire again next year. Even though with that being said, his value will rise given the situation in Cincinnati. Moving on over to the tight end position, Pat Freiermuth, tight end 13, Darnell Washington, tight end 41. Pat Freiermuth is somebody that I think is a huge breakout candidate, somebody that I'm very excited about. He's definitely a buy for me. I think he's really the true number 2 receiver in this passing game behind George Pickens. While Roman Wilson, I think, will break out, especially later in the year, Pat Freiermuth is certainly going to start the season as the number 2 option, and we've seen a lot of flashes from him, and this could really be the time now that he breaks out. Better quarterback play, he's healthy, and I really like the situation. He's somebody that I have on a number of teams, and if I were you, I would encourage you to go take a look. I don't think the cost is going to be that high, because I do think that people are a little bit concerned about, the Arthur Smith passing attack and the fact that Kyle Pitts didn't do anything with him as, the head coach down there in Atlanta. So there are some concerns, and I think that people are mildly worried about the situation. So if you can go in and get him at a pretty good deal, I think, right now. Now, moving on to the last few things on this episode. I mentioned at the top of the show that at the end of each of these divisional previews, I'm going to give you some names. So the biggest buy, the biggest sell, the biggest sleeper, and the biggest breakout candidate for the division as a whole. So starting at the top, for the biggest buy at their current market value on Keep Trade Cut in the AFC North, I'm going to go with tight end Mark Andrews from the Baltimore Ravens. Tight end 6 on Keep Trade Cut. And like I mentioned just a little bit ago, Mark Andrews is somebody that can be the number 1 tight end in the entire league if he stays healthy. He's on a great offense. He's got that connection with Lamar Jackson. And I think even if he isn't the overall tight end 1, I think he certainly is somebody that I would expect to be in the top 5 over the next few years. And he's young enough that I'm not worried about the age cliff. He'll be 29 at the start of the season. So Mark Andrews, big time buy for me, somebody that I'm very interested in, also in redraft or in best ball, pretty much all formats. I think Mark Andrews is somebody that I would love to have on my roster. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the biggest sell at current market value is Deshaun Watson. So somebody that I've talked about before in other episodes. He's currently QB 25, which I actually think is quite fair. But because quarterbacks are valued so highly as it is, he is somebody that I would be looking to unload. See if you can find somebody that is a big Deshaun Watson believer. There are plenty out there, and you never really know what you can get. But quarterbacks, they're valued so highly. You're going to be able to get a good player regardless, of the position, whether you work it into a deal to upgrade at quarterback, to take a flyer on, a younger, unproven quarterback, but then get an added piece on top, or whether it's, a wide receiver, something along those lines. I think you can still get a pretty quality asset in return for Deshaun Watson. My biggest sleeper in the AFC North is going to be rookie wide receiver Roman Wilson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So wide receiver 55, and like I mentioned, I think he's going to be the wide receiver 2 in this offense. I'm not worried about Van Jefferson. I do really like Pat Freiermuth again, but you're talking about potentially the third option in this passing attack, and he's going to be in the slot. He's going to get some targets. We could see, he has some shades of a Deontay Johnson type of player in him. He's going to get a lot of targets, so I think he's somebody that people are sleeping on a bit in their dynasty leagues. You can acquire him for a third-round pick. I think that's a smash at that price, and I have him on a number of my teams, and I would encourage you to find a way to add him to yours as well. And last but not least, our breakout candidate, going back to the tight end position, is Pat Freiermuth, tight end 13. I think that we absolutely see him enter the top 10 at the position as the season goes on. I think there's just a real good opportunity for him to be the clear number 2 in this offense. No more Deontay Johnson. Better quarterback play, whether it's Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. I think either one would be good for Pat Freiermuth. While Russell Wilson might be a little bit better of a passer, we saw Justin Fields have a really good connection with Cole Kmet in Chicago. So, that tight end connection is there for him. So either way, I like the situation, and Pat Freiermuth is my breakout candidate. So with all that, thank you so much for tuning in. That has been today's show on the AFC North. Stay tuned for next week's episode where we break down another division. And again, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the support on the Listener League. And go give us a follow on Twitter if you do not already, at Dynasty War Room. Thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you all next week.